Vladimir Putin has spent 20 years building one political lie, that he is the ultimate, untouchable master of Russia's war machine, that the military he purged, rebuilt, and terrorized is a perfectly obedient extension of his will. But tonight, that lie is dissolving. We are seeing a red flag so serious, senior U.S. officials are no longer talking just about the war in Ukraine. They are talking about the stability of the Russian state itself. Good evening. The image Putin projects, the omniscient ruler whose security services know everything and whose generals march in lockstep, has been ripped apart. You already know about the body blows, the armed mutiny by the Wagner mercenaries that seized a Russian city and drove toward Moscow in 2023. The humiliating ouster of his defense minister amid corruption and battlefield chaos. The chilling reports of Russian soldiers being executed by their own commanders for refusing suicidal orders. But this week, something far more politically dangerous is happening. It's not a teenager posting anti-war slogans in Moscow. It's not a mercenary warlord. It is a rebellion of the mind, an open challenge from within the most respected, most decorated ranks of the Russian military establishment. People who wore the uniform, commanded the troops, and benefited from Putin's system for years are now publicly, calmly, and devastatingly challenging the very foundation of this war, and by extension, the man who ordered it. In today's Russia, this isn't just a policy debate. It's treason. This kind of criticism can land ordinary Russians in prison for years. Yet a former, high-ranking commander of Russia's ground forces has just given an interview that breaks every rule. He essentially says the system lied to itself. The invasion of Ukraine, the famed 3-day push to Kiev, he calls it a fantasy built on wishful thinking and false intelligence. He declares that military leadership knew for months the unstoppable advance had collapsed, but they lied to the public, to the troops, and likely to Putin himself. You do not say this in public unless you are speaking to a much larger and far more dangerous audience than the state censor. You are speaking directly to the disillusioned officer corps, the colonels and majors, who have been ordered again and again to throw untrained conscripts and prison recruits into a meat grinder. This is the context U.S. intelligence is staring at tonight. And the picture that emerges is grim, raising the core question: is Putin losing control of the people who hold the guns? When U.S. officials look at this internal dissent, they aren't seeing an isolated incident. They are reading it alongside months of intelligence reports about plummeting morale, fractured discipline, and the desperate, brutal lengths the Russian military is going to just to keep the war machine moving. The picture is less confident army and more leadership terrified of its own troops. Independent investigations, the kind banned inside Russia, but still operating outside its borders, describe a system where respect and belief in the mission have long since run out, replaced by raw terror. We are talking about Russian commanders executing or deliberately sacrificing their own soldiers for refusing to attack. Reports document field units holding ad hoc punishment pits, literal holes in the ground where men who say no to orders are beaten, starved, or immediately sent to the most dangerous parts of the front as cannon fodder. This is the level of internal decay Western analysts are tracking. You don't resort to mass executions of your own men if you have control. You do it when your authority is eroding and your troops no longer believe in the fight. This reality is now bleeding into the public sphere, even among the most loyal mouthpieces, pro-Kremlin military analysts. The television generals and think tankers who usually parrot the party line have started to crack. They are admitting, often in coded language to avoid prison, that the war is not following the promised script. They acknowledge that Ukraine's economy has not collapsed, that Western aid has not evaporated, and that Russian losses are enormous, forcing the country into an unsustainable strain to keep up the material and political costs. For a regime that survives on carefully manufactured reality, these little cracks in the narrative are monumental. They tell the officers, the conscripts, and the Russian public that the emperor has no clothes, Now, layer the battle facts on top of this. Russia has spent nearly 2 years grinding its way toward the fortress city of Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine, a relatively small gain achieved at a stunning, almost unimaginable cost. Western assessments suggest tens of thousands of troops and thousands of armored vehicles have been lost for a handful of villages. The message sent to the officers on the ground and the sailors in the Black Sea Fleet is clear. Whatever Moscow says about inevitable victory, they can see the war is not a great triumphant march. It's an endless, bloody treadmill of attrition. This is the context that gives this new wave of high-level resistance its terrifying power. For months, intelligence officials in Washington and European capitals have been on high alert, watching for signs that the immense strain on the Russian military, the casualties, the lack of rotation, the appalling equipment, might start to manifest not just as desertions, but as a slow-motion rebellion among the officer corps. They were looking for quiet signals, battalion commanders pushing back against reckless orders, generals arguing with the Kremlin's political minders about what is militarily possible, and military bloggers, often with deep ties to serving officers, criticizing decisions they hint were made for television, not for victory. Tonight, they say, those quiet signals are becoming a deafening roar. There are increasing reports of mid-level commanders refusing to carry out especially reckless, suicidal offensives or attempts to deliberately slow the pace of attacks to conserve their men and equipment. These are not grand speeches in Red Square. These are quiet acts of insubordination up the chain of command, pushback over ammunition shortages, unsustainable casualty rates, and the complete lack of rest for units that have been stuck in the trenches for months on end. Crucially, none of this means a coup is around the corner. We are not talking about 1917, where Soviets are forming in the trenches and Tsarist officers are being thrown into rivers. The system still holds, but the crucial point U.S. officials are making is that a pillar of Putin's personal power is cracking. The absolute, unquestioning compliance of the people with guns. This pillar is under more pressure than at any time since the Wagner mutiny, which, let's not forget, briefly seized a major Russian city and drove within a few hundred kilometers of the capital. The Wagner rebellion ended with its leader, Prigozhin, dead in a suspicious plane crash 2 months later, but it left an indelible scar. Analysts inside the Pentagon still talk about the shock of those hours when Russia's own military stood aside and watched as thousands of armed mercenaries rolled toward Moscow. That was the moment when it became terrifyingly plausible to imagine someone with tanks refusing the script the Kremlin had written. Now the dissent is subtler, more institutional, and perhaps more deeply rooted. Putin can purge individuals, but he cannot easily purge the collective. Disillusionment of his entire command structure. This is the real danger. Since the near catastrophe of the Wagner mutiny, Putin has desperately tried to reassert control through purges and dramatic reshuffles. He removed his longtime defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, a political ally and a figure who had stood with him through the annexation of Crimea, and replaced him with a technocrat, an economist with no uniform. This was a clear attempt to tie the war machine more tightly to Russia's broader economy and to dilute the power of the traditional uniformed brass. He has allowed corruption investigations to nibble at the edges of his own defense ministry, with a deputy minister arrested on bribery charges in what looked like a textbook. Warning shot to the rest of the elite. No one is untouchable. He also tried to fold the remnants of the massive Wagner paramilitary organization, their businesses, their propaganda outlets, and their fighters into the formal state structure. All of this was designed to send a single, clear message. There is one commander-in-chief, one center of gravity, and the days of freelance warlords are over. But American officials see a profound problem that cannot be fixed by arrests or reshuffles. You can remove individuals. You can redistribute the money. You can arrest a few scapegoats for corruption. What you cannot easily repair is the fundamental trust between the men giving the orders and the men expected to die carrying them out. When a former top general, a pillar of the system, goes on the record to say, in essence, "We lied to ourselves about this war. We misled our own president. We completely misread Ukraine," that is not a shot at a faceless intelligence officer in a basement. That is a shot at the system itself. That statement undermines the entire rationale for the war and every casualty that has resulted from it. U.S. officials are taking note because when an authoritarian system starts to doubt its own narrative and its own competency, its behavior becomes infinitely harder to predict. The internal logic breaks down. For Washington, this is not an academic exercise. Even as political administrations signal a desire for de-escalation, the career intelligence professionals, the people who read the intel cables and watch the satellite feeds, are flagging a Russia whose leadership is nervous, whose conventional forces are under immense strain, and whose internal cohesion is showing dangerous cracks. This volatile combination is precisely why the phrase "serious red flag" is dominating top-level discussions in the Pentagon and the National Security Council. In meetings at the highest levels of U.S. security, the phrase "serious red flag" has emerged in three distinct critical contexts. These aren't just analyst concerns. They are indicators that Putin's control is failing in unprecedented ways, making Russia more brittle and simultaneously more dangerous. First red flag: the use of terror as discipline. The treatment of Russian soldiers who refuse to fight. The documented use of executions and deliberate suicide missions as a tool of internal discipline is seen as a sign that basic command authority is eroding, not strengthening. You don't have to execute your own men to keep them in line if they still genuinely support the mission and respect their chain of command. The necessity of terror suggests the only thing holding the front together is fear, which is a fragile and unsustainable bond. Second red flag: the test balloon of dissent. The public, high-profile criticism from respected figures like the retired ground forces commander is interpreted as a test balloon. The Kremlin is faced with a no-win scenario. If it lets the criticism slide, it suggests it is too weak or too afraid to silence a decorated officer, which emboldens other grumblers. If it cracks down, arresting or silencing the commander, it risks turning a grumbling officer corps into a fearful but also deeply resentful and potentially explosive one. Either outcome creates political risk and internal instability that Putin can ill afford. Third red flag: the fraying narrative. The broader Russian information environment is pointing to a system whose internal story is unraveling. Pro-government analysts are quietly acknowledging problems they never would have before. Military bloggers, key influencers close to the fighting, are complaining openly about incompetent tactics and leadership failures. Leaked documents suggest even the FSB, Russia's security service, is uneasy about some of Moscow's foreign entanglements and the true state of the war effort. This combination of battlefield attrition, economic strain from sanctions, and visible dissent among the elites is a textbook sign for U.S. analysts that decision-making in Moscow will become more erratic and more driven by short-term survival rather than long-term national strategy. The U.S. has spent decades studying how authoritarian states look from the inside when they are under stress. This specific combination, a visible disconnect between the commander-in-chief and his officer corps, coupled with a reliance on brutality to enforce orders, is not always a sign that collapse is imminent, but it is always a sign that the leadership is nervous and that a sudden, unpredictable lashing out is increasingly likely. This internal Russian drama is both an opportunity and a danger for Ukraine and the West. For Ukraine, this internal Russian drama is a double-edged sword, a massive opportunity mixed with acute danger. On one hand, the cracks in Russian unity between the Kremlin and the generals, between the commanders and the troops, make it exponentially harder for Moscow to sustain the kind of relentless grinding offensives that have chewed up cities like Avdiivka and Pokrovsk. Disillusioned commanders are less likely to execute reckless orders. Dispirited troops are less effective in combat. This complicates Russia's efforts to rotate units, push fresh forces into the line, and maintain the illusion that victory is inevitable. Time, which Moscow has always banked on, may no longer be on Russia's side in the way the Kremlin tells itself. On the other hand, a nervous and internally conflicted Kremlin is a Kremlin that may feel overwhelming pressure to demonstrate strength and reassert that it still calls the shots. This is where the danger comes in. That pressure can translate into more devastating missile attacks on Ukrainian cities, more pressure on the energy grid, or more aggressive nuclear saber-rattling aimed at scaring the West away from deeper support. It is the action of a cornered, wounded animal trying to project dominance. For the United States and NATO, the conundrum is massive. How do you respond to a Russia that is simultaneously more brittle and more dangerous? The current political signals from some in Washington emphasize avoiding direct confrontation and seeking a negotiated end to the war. There have been rare, high-level communications between U.S. and Russian military leaders over the last year, even as the war rages, precisely to avoid a catastrophic miscalculation. But tonight, as these new signs of internal resistance inside the Russian military become clearer, the U.S. intelligence community is updating its core risk assessments. They are asking the terrifying questions. If Putin's control over his own war machine is not absolute, who exactly is making decisions in a crisis? And how confident can anyone be that everyone with their finger on a trigger, from a battalion commander to a nuclear launch officer, will follow instructions in a predictable way? Those questions echo far beyond the Donbass trenches. They touch on NATO's entire posture in Eastern Europe, the alliance's decisions about missile defenses and forward deployments, and the flow of military aid to Ukraine. They influence whether European leaders believe they are dealing with a rational, tightly controlled adversary, or a more fragmented, factionalized system where intra-elite rivalries matter as much as national strategy. This internal rot is changing the global risk equation in real time. Remember, the last time we saw open rebellion by armed men loyal to a Russian warlord of a Wagner mutiny, it happened with almost no warning. And for nearly 24 hours, the world had to grapple with the terrifying possibility that a nuclear-armed state might be entering a full-blown internal power struggle. That event left a scar, a blueprint for potential chaos. That is why what might look from a distance like just another retired general complaining about the past is being treated in Washington as a Category 5 red flag under an authoritarian system like Putin's. The line between military analysis and political dissent is almost invisible. People do not talk like this unless they sense the Kremlin is weaker, unless they see a chance to influence the next phase of the war, or unless they are trying to hedge their own bets against a future where they will have to explain to a court what they did during these years. As we watch the latest wave of Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities and the slow, bloody movement of the front lines, we must remember that wars are not only decided by weapons and terrain. They are decided by institutions, by morale, and by belief. They are decided by whether the people ordered to fight still believe in the authority of the people giving those orders. Inside Russia, cracks in that fundamental belief are widening. U.S. officials see that as a crucial warning. This war is entering a more volatile phase in which the greatest danger may not come only from what Putin decides to do, but from what happens if the institutions beneath him decide they will no longer pay any price to keep him in power. A weaker, more internally conflicted Russia is not automatically a safer Russia. It is a Russia that may lash out more often, take greater risks, and use terror against its own soldiers and its neighbors to try and hold together a crumbling narrative. This is the reality confronting Western policymakers tonight. The image of Vladimir Putin as the unchallengeable master of his own war is dimmer than it has been in a very long time. And that in the words of those watching this most closely, is a serious red flag, not just for the Kremlin, but for a world that has to live with whatever happens next.